We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and this is a rather old book from who we assumed to be solely a science fiction writer. We have heard of him, but we never really read his books. This is by Issac Asimov, The Land of Canaan, because we have heard or seen say the Hebrew Israelites, etc., saying that they were all black or African, etc. But we found some interesting information looking at the original ancient, very old Tab Asherit Aramaic Old Testament Book of Brita, or in the Aramaic, or Genesis in English. But before we get to that, we'll have a look at who is Issac Asimov, because people may not know who he actually was. He was an American writer and professor of biochemistry at Boston University. During his lifetime, Asimov was considered one of the big three science fiction writers, along with Robert A. Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. A prolific writer, he wrote or edited more than 500 books. He also wrote an estimated 90,000 letters and postcards. Best known for his hard science fiction, Asimov also wrote mysteries and fantasy, as well as much non-fiction, and there he is pictured there. His most famous work is the Foundation series, the first three books of which won the one-time Hugo Award for Best All-Time Series in 1966. His other major series are the Galactic Empire series and the Robot series. The Galactic Empire novels are set in a much earlier history of the same fictional universe as the Foundation series. Later, with Foundation and Earth, 1986, he linked this distant future to the Robot series, creating a unified future history for his works. He also wrote over 380 short stories and so forth. Most of his popular science books explain concepts in a historical way, going as far back as possible to a time when the science in question was at its simplest stage. Examples include Guide to Science, a 3-volume Understanding Physics, and Asimov's Chronology of Science and Discovery, and so forth. He was president of the American Humanists Association, and so forth. Surname. There are three very simple English words: has, him, and of. Put them together like this: has, him, of, and say it in an ordinary fashion. Now leave out the two H's and say it again, and you have Asimov. Asimov from 1979. Looks like it. His name derives from Russian patronymic. And so forth. Here's his life. His quote: "I have had a good life and I have accomplished all I wanted to, and more than I had a right to expect I would." Asimov, 1990. His early life. He was born in Petrovichi, Russia, SFSR, Russian Soviet Federation Socialist Republic. And it talks about his parents, a family of Russian Jewish millers, and so forth. In 1921, Asimov and 16 other children in Petrovichi developed pneumonia. Only Asimov survived. He later had two younger siblings, a sister, Marcia, and brother Stanley, and so forth. And they travelled to the United States. After becoming established in the US, his parents owned a succession of candy stores in which everyone in the family was expected to work. It's his education and career. Looks like he tried to apply for medical school but was rejected. In between his studies, he earned 2 degrees. He spent 3 years during World War II working as a civilian chemist at the Philadelphia Navy Yard's Naval Air Experimental Station, living in the Walnut Hill section of West Philadelphia from 1942 to 1945. Personal life. He meets his wife in 1917, Gertrude Blugerman, on a blind date, February 14th, 1942, and married her on July 26th. And here's some things he was afraid of. Asimov was a claustrophile. He enjoyed small enclosed spaces. In the third volume of his autobiography, he recalls a childhood desire to own a magazine stand in the New York City subway station, because they're really, really small and compact, within which he could enclose himself and listen to the rumble of the passing trains while reading. But Asimov was afraid of flying, doing so only twice, once in the course of his work at the Naval Air Experimental Station, and once returning to the Wendell Earth and once returning home from Oahu, was it in Hawaii or somewhere, 1946. Consequently, he seldom travelled great distances. This phobia influenced several of his fiction works, such as the Wendell Earth mystery stories and robot novels featuring Elijah Bailey, and so forth. He was an able speaker and regularly hired to give talks about science. And this is interest. In 1984, the American Humanist Association named him the Humanist of the Year. He was one of the signers of the Human Manifesto. He was also a close friend of Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry, and earned a screen credit as a special science consultant on Star Trek The Motion Picture for advice he gave during production, and so forth. Asimov described Carl Sagan as one of the two people he ever met whose intellect surpassed his own. The other, he claimed, was a computer scientist and artificial intelligence expert, Marvin Minsky. And then he passed away in 1971, suffering heart attack, and contracted HIV from blood transfusion. His HIV status was kept secret out of concern that the anti-AIDS prejudice might extend to his family members. He died in Manhattan and was cremated. The cause of death was reported as heart and kidney failure. 10 years following Asimov's death, Janet and Robin Asimov agreed that the HIV story should be made public. Janet revealed it in her edition of his autobiography, It's Been a Good Life. And here's more information here about Asimov and his science fiction. There's some of his early works. Looks like 1951. Published in 1951. Plenty more information there. Popular Science, and a quote by Asimov. Just say I am one of the most versatile writers in the world and the greatest popularizer of many subjects. Asimov, 1969. Other writings. He published Asimov's Guide to the Bible in 2 volumes, covering the Old Testament in 1967 and the New Testament in 1969, and then combined them into one 1,300-page volume in 1981, complete with maps and tables. The guide goes through the books of the Bible in order, explaining the history of each one and the political influences that affected it, as well as biographical information about the important characters. His interest in literature manifested itself in several annotations of literary works, including Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare and so forth. And he wrote a lot of limericks apparently. Was heavily involved with the Gene Roddenberry Star Trek. And there's more information here on his writing style, etc. And people's comments on him. In the early days of science fiction, some authors and critics felt that the romantic elements of his books were inappropriate in science fiction stories, which were supposedly to be focused on science and technology. Isaac Asimov was a supporter of this point of view, expressed in his 1938-39 letters to Astounding, where he described such elements as mush and slop. To his dismay, these letters were met with strong opposition. Asimov attributed the lack of romance and sex in his fiction to the early imprinting from starting his writing career when he had never been on a date and didn't know anything about girls. He was sometimes criticised for the general absence of sex and of extraterrestrial life in his science fiction. He claimed he wrote The Gods Themselves in 1972 to respond to these criticisms, which often came from new wave science fiction and often British writers. The second part of 3 of the novel is set on an alien world with 3 sexes, and the sexual behaviour of these creatures is extensively depicted. Religion. Asimov was an atheist, a humanist and a rationalist. He did not oppose religious convictions in others, but he frequently railed against superstitious and pseudoscientific beliefs that tried to pass themselves off as genuine science. During his childhood, his father and mother observed the traditions of Orthodox Judaism less stringently than they had it in Petrovichi. They did not force their beliefs upon young Isaac, and he grew up without strong religious influences, coming to believe that the Torah represented Hebrew mythology in the same way that Iliad recorded Greek mythology. When he was 13, he chose not to have a bar mitzvah, as his books, Treasure of Humour and Asimov Laughs Again, record. Asimov was willing to tell jokes involving God, Satan, the Garden of Eden, Jerusalem and other religious topics, expressing the viewpoint that a good joke can do more to provoke thought than hours of philosophical discussion. For a brief while, his father worked in the local synagogue to enjoy the familiar surroundings and, as Isaac put it, shine as a learned scholar, versed in the sacred writings. This scholarship was a seed for his later authorship and publication of Asimov's Guide to the Bible, an analysis of the historic foundations for the Old and New Testaments. For many years, Asimov called himself an atheist. He considered the term somewhat inadequate, as it described what he did not believe rather than what he did. Eventually, he described himself as a humanist and considered that term more practical. Asimov continued to identify himself as a secular Jew. As stated in his introduction to Jack Dan's anthology of Jewish science fiction, Wandering Stars. In his quote, "I attend no services and follow no ritual and have never undergone that curious puberty rite, the bar mitzvah. It doesn't matter. I am Jewish." Unquote. When asked in an interview in 1982 if he was an atheist, Asimov replied, "I am an atheist, out and out. It took me a long time to say it. I've been an atheist for years and years, but somehow I felt it was intellectually unrespectable to say one was an atheist, because it assumed knowledge that one didn't have. Somehow it was better to say one was a humanist or an agnostic." He finally decided that he was a creature of emotion as well of reason. Emotionally, he was an atheist. He didn't have the evidence to prove that God didn't exist or doesn't exist, but he so strongly suspected he didn't that he didn't want to waste his time. Likewise, he said about religious education that he would not be satisfied to have his kids choose to be religious without trying to argue them out of it. And just as he would not be satisfied to have them decide to smoke regularly or engage in any other practice he considered detrimental to mind or body. In his last volume of autobiography, Asimov wrote, If he were not an atheist, he would believe in a God who would choose to save people on the basis of the totality of their lives and not the pattern of their words. And he thought he would prefer an honest and righteous atheist to a TV preacher whose every word is God, 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 and whose every deed is foul, foul, foul. The same memoir states his belief that hell is the drooling dream of a sadist, crudely affixed to an all-merciful God, if even human governments were willing to curtail cruel and unusual punishments. Wondered Asimov, why would this God punish someone in the afterlife, not be restricted to a limited term? Why would punishment in the afterlife not be restricted to a limited term? There are some denominations out there who believe, well, you only go to hell and get tortured and all this sort of stuff for a little while. Yeah. Then you're forgiven. Asimov rejected the idea that a human belief or action could merit infinite punishment. If an afterlife existed, he claimed the longest and most severe punishment would be reserved for those who slandered God by inventing hell. Asimov said about using religious motives in his writings that he tended to ignore religion in his own stories altogether, except when he absolutely had to have it. And whenever he brought in a religious motive, that religion was bound to seem vaguely Christian because that is the only religion he knew anything about, even though it is not his. An unsympathetic reader might think that he was burlesquing Christianity, but he wasn't. Then too, it would have been impossible to write science fiction and really ignore religion. And he mentions here about his ideas of politics. After Asimov's name appeared in the mid-1960s on a list of people the Communist Party USA considered amenable to its goals, the FBI investigated him. Because of his academic background, the Bureau briefly considered Asimov as a possible candidate for known Soviet spy Rob Prof, but found nothing suspicious in his life or background. Asimov appeared to hold an equivocal attitude towards Israel. In his first autobiography, he indicates his support for the safety of Israel, though insisting that he was not a Zionist. In his third autobiography, Asimov stated his opposition to the creation of a Jewish state on the grounds that he was opposed to having nation-states in general and supported the notion of a single humanity. Asimov especially worried about the safety of Israel, given that it had been created among hostile Muslim neighbours, and said that Jews had merely created for themselves another Jewish ghetto. And it mentions social issues. He considered himself a feminist even before women's liberation became a widespread movement. He argued that the issue of women's rights was closely connected to that of population control and so forth. And then some insights he had about computerization, and continued about education. And he may have been in a sexual harassment case, for here it says Asimov would often fondle, kiss and pinch women at conventions and elsewhere, but like the Ron Jeremy, right? And elsewhere without regard for their consent. According to Alec Nevala Lee, author of an Asimov biography and writer on the history of science fiction, he often defended himself by saying that far from showing objections, these women cooperated. In a 1971 satirical piece, The Sensuous Dirty Old Man, Asimov wrote, "The question then is not whether or not a girl should be touched. The question is merely where, when and how she should be touched." According to Nevala Lee, however, many of these encounters were clearly non-consensual. He wrote that Asimov's behaviour as a leading science fiction author and personality contributed to an undesirable atmosphere for women in the male-dominated science fiction community. In support of this, he quoted some of Asimov's contemporary fellow authors such as Judith Merrill, Hardin Allison, and Frederick Pohl, and so forth. Additional specific incidents were reported by other people, including Edward L. Furman, longtime editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, who wrote, "Instead of shaking my date's hand, he shook her left breast." And there's more information here. And he enjoyed other writers like J.R.R. Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, and so forth. The feeling of friendship and respect between Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke of 2001 Space Odyssey fame were demonstrated by the so-called Clarke-Asimov Treaty of Park Avenue, negotiated as they shared a cab in New York. This stated that Asimov was required to insist that Clarke was the best science fiction writer in the world, reserving second best for himself, while Clarke was required to insist that Asimov was the best science fiction writer in the world, reserving second best for himself, and so forth. So that's information on who Isaac Asimov was. And here's all the books that were published by Doubleday & Co. Written by Asimov. And he even starred in some movies. As we mentioned, he starred on Star Trek and so forth. Okay, you're going to have a look at his book, The Land of Canaan, because in the Brita, the original Brita of the Tav Asrat, the original ancient, very old manuscripts, translated into the nearest English equivalent by native-born Aramaic-speaking translator Victor N. Alexander from Bet Narain or Mesopotamia, Syria. We have Brita in the Aramaic or Genesis in the English. And this is Genesis 10:6. And this is genealogy of Noah's children. Noah and his descendants, there's children's descendants, right? Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, to whom was born children after the flood. And the children of Cam, we're thinking that means Chem, or the Kemites, Egypt. Okay. Okay, this is the children of Cam, this is descendants, right? That became these people. Okay. We're Cush. Notice the C here. That's talking about them in those that were in the Mesopotamian region, not the ones in Africa. To differentiate them, there's usually a K to show that it's the Nigerians or whoever they were in Africa. Okay, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan, and there's a footnote indication here. Okay, so we're going to have a look at that. 10:6. Literal Aramaic name Egyptians. Okay. That's what that name means. Egyptians. Okay. And the children of Cush were Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, etc., etc. And to Cush was born Nimrod, who began to be a giant of the earth. He was a lion-hearted giant before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a lion-hearted giant before the Lord. And he was head of his kingdom, which included Babylon, Erech, or modern-day Iraq. Yeah, that's the old ancient name for it, Erech. Akkad and Kala in the land of Sumer. Remember where the all men gathered in this desert region in Sumer, Shinar, and built the Ziggurat or Tower of Babel. From these lands there emerged the Asheroi, who built Nineveh and the towns of Rehoboth and Calah, and reasoned the great city between Nineveh and Calah. Okay, so we're looking at this one here. Yes, I think that's Egypt, right? But what we found looking at the history is that the Egyptians went into that area, that land, and basically ruled it. They had defences there, like towers and all that sort of stuff, because they're constantly getting attacked by Hittites, etc., etc. So they had these like towers, etc., or whatever, to keep an eye out, sort of thing. These camps to keep an eye out of these people coming through. But apparently those Egyptian desert area were very like walls, right? And you can only come through a certain way, something like that. It's sort of to do with history. That's what we found. Okay, yeah, so that's Egypt. So we're going to look at this guy's book. Okay, quickly have a look at it. He's written other books on other peoples. And here's your contents. Before Abraham, after Abraham, Israel, Judah, Judaism, Canaan versus Greece, and so forth. Table of dates, genealogies, and then the index. Before Abraham, known as the Fertile Crescent, in Western Asia, in the nation of Iraq, there are two rivers that flow from the Turkish mountains to the Persian Gulf. They are the Tigris River, and the Euphrates River, Euphrates. Makes it easier for you to say it. These two rivers are an unfailing source of water, so that the land around them and between them is particularly suitable for agriculture. That's why it's called the fertile land, or the Fertile Crescent, right? With mild weather, rainy winters and dry summers. Its fertility is all the more noticeable because to the northeast are the rugged mountains of Iran, and to the southwest the dry Arabian desert. This strip extends from the Persian Gulf northwestward up to the rivers to the borders of Turkey. It stretches to the west across southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, then follows the Mediterranean coastline southward, including not only the coast of Syria, but also Lebanon, North Israel, and western Jordan. And there's lots more there. So what we basically found with the people from Cush, C-U-S-H, Mesopotamian, Syria, that geographical location, is that somebody there in the genealogy list, in Genesis, probably Cush. Yeah, Cush. Yeah, Cush, who was born, who had the son Nimrod. He probably migrated to Africa and started a tribe there, the Cushites. But it's different, right? You differentiate it because it's the ones in Mesopotamia, like here, right? Here, his name's Cush. Okay, translated as Cush. But when it goes to the African one, for you to understand that this was his tribe re-established again, and probably invited in Africans, and they merged with those, intermingled, intermarried, whatever with them. So that's when you get the Cushites, okay, with a capital, with a K, capital K, okay. Yeah, it's something you came across. Okay, so going back to this book. Oh, it's not the book. Okay, the most important human fact about the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Valley is that, as far as we know, as far as he knew as well, civilization began there. So it began in the Nile Valley. That's what he's saying. That the most important human fact about the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Valley is that, as far as we know, civilization began there. It was in or near these regions, or those regions, that agriculture was first developed, pottery was first made, animals were first tamed, cities were first built, and writing was first invented. We also read that Mesopotamia, Syria, a lot of people came out of there and probably were descendants of those people, and then they eventually became the Egyptians. That's just what we've come across. Individual cities were first combined into large regions ruled by a central authority at the extreme ends of these areas. About 2800 BC, along the lower reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerian civilization was in full swing, while at the same time, along the Nile River, the Egyptian civilization was flourishing. Both eventually formed large empires. The two civilizations were fortunate in that they were so far apart they could not interfere with each other in a hostile fashion. For 2,000 years after the two civilizations had formed, there was no direct military contact. Neither one had to fight off the other. Neither one had the opportunity to destroy the other, or the chance to be destroyed. There was, however, trade between the two across the gap between them, and that helped them both. So they probably exchanged ideas as well, like language, writing, all that sort of stuff. But what about the section of fertile area between Sumeria and Egypt? What about the western half of the Fertile Crescent? The western half is smaller than the eastern half and not quite as fertile. It is also smaller and less fertile than the Nile Valley. Nevertheless, in the very earliest days of civilization, that western half was as advanced as the other portions. It was, however, in between. It could never expect the peace that comes with isolation. The civilizations of the Tigris-Euphrates always reached westward in the hope of dominating the Mediterranean coast, and civilization of Egypt has persistently reached northward. Caught in the middle, the Mediterranean coast could have no opportunity to develop an empire. It remained a collection of city-states and small, weak nations. Through all its history, it was dominated by its neighbour empires. Syria and Egypt were empires, with the exception of one small gap in time about 1000 BC. Most history books tend to pay a great deal of attention to large empires, their great victories and defeats. The little cities and nations that never form empires or loom large in war tend to be skipped over. The western part of the Fertile Crescent is therefore usually taken up in connection with the various empires that dominated it at one period or another in history. And yet the western end of the Fertile Crescent has, for its size, contributed more to modern Western civilization than did all the mighty empires of the Nile Valley and of the Tigris-Euphrates. Just to mention two items, it was from the strip of land bordering the eastern Mediterranean that the modern alphabet arose. It was there also that a religion developed that in various forms now dominates Europe, the Americas, Western Asia and Northern Africa. For these two contributions alone, the western part of the Fertile Crescent deserves a history book of its own, one that concentrates on the events that took place in that small but extremely important portion of the world. It would be helpful, though, to have a name for the entire area, since the western part of the Fertile Crescent is a clumsy phrase which is too long to be used all the time. No one nation occupies the whole area now. It is split up among Syria, Lebanon, Israel and Jordan at that time of writing. So we can't use one particular modern name. In the past it was also split up among different nations: Moab, Edom, Ammon, Judah, Aram and so on. In ancient times, one name that was used for at least part of the area was Canaan. It is a name that is familiar to the modern people of the West because it is used in the Bible. For convenience sake, then we'll call the strip of Mediterranean coast that makes up the western end of the Fertile Crescent the land of Canaan. And that's where Abraham, he was born in Ur of Chaldee, and his people before him, his relations, etc., they were let's have a look at that. Sons of Eber. We've gone over this before. Okay, so further down, here we go. And Shelah lived 30 years or something, and to him was born Eber. And Shelah's line after the birth of Eber was 403 years, etc., etc. And Eber lived 34 years, and to him was born Peleg. And Eber's line after Peleg was born lasted 430 years, this is lineage, and to him were born many sons and daughters, and so forth. This Eber supposedly is the father of the Hebrews. But if you get down here further, where is it? Sure, it's further, it's up. It tells you these old manuscripts, original ancient manuscripts translated into the nearest English equivalent, tell you that, will show you that in 21, Brita, or Genesis 21, to Shem, Japheth's great brother, there was also born children. He became the father of all the children of passage. Footnote there, right? And the children of Shem were the Elamites, or Elamites, the Asherites, the Arpachshadai, the Lotians, and the Arameans, those who spoke the language of their forefather Aram, or Aramaic. And there's the children of Aram, which were Uz, etc., etc. And to Arpachshad was born Shelah, and to Shelah was born Eber. And there's a footnote indication there. 1021, literal Aramaic idiom, or expression, Hebrews. So they were people, children of passage. And here's another footnote here. Literal Aramaic name, Hebrew, comes from this name, Awer, to cross over. Someone who crosses over, implying passage, implying that Abraham was told by God to leave his land, and he got as far as Haran, and then eventually got to Canaan. His people got there, and the land was full of Canaanites, Hivites, possibly Amorites or something like that. Here's the Canaanite lineage, verse 19. And the Canaanite lineage spread from Sidon to the outskirts of Gadar until Gaza. Yeah, it's that strip where Israel is situated at the moment. Yeah, Gaza is part of that. To the outskirts of Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, it's in the Bible. That's where Lot ended up, and there it was destroyed because of their sins. Admah and Zeboim, or Zeboim, until Lasha. So that's where that Canaan, right here, their forefather Canaan had these children. So like to him was born Sidon, his son Sidon, his heir because he's the oldest son. Yeah. So when he dies, he becomes the chief. Yeah. He becomes the leader. And the Hittites and Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites and the Sionites, and the Arvadites, the Zemarites and Hamathites. And after that, the tribes of Canaan spread out. So these are all the tribes coming from that, descendants of Sidon. So possibly they migrated, and that's where they ended up in this place called Canaan, after their forefather. And that's where Abraham, etc., went to. This land occupied by these people. They're probably related. Sounds like they're related, because it was the land of milk and honey promised Abraham by God, and he only got to Haran. It says he got to Haran. Okay, it's another verse, probably Genesis 8, that he got as far as Haran, and then he eventually went into Canaan. Okay, so go back to this book again. Okay, and there's a new Stone Age. Goes on about that. It's even possible that Jericho is the oldest city ever to exist. Where does it say here? Among the earliest of such cities was one which eventually came to be known as Jericho. It is even possible that Jericho is the oldest city ever to exist, in which case the very notion of cities was first invented in Canaan. He explains about that, what he describes it. The oldest traces of human habitation in Jericho have been dated back to 7,800 BC, nearly 10,000 years ago. At first there may have been nothing but small huts making up the city, but these gave way to eventually to more substantial houses. By 7,000 BC, the city was surrounded by a strong stone wall that enclosed 10 acres and included at least one tower that was 30 feet high, and from which a sentry could keep efficient watch for the approaching enemy. 10 acres may not seem like much by modern standards, but in those days houses were small and the people huddled together. Even without skyscrapers, the city might have held over 2,000 people. More information on Jericho. Goes into details about pottery during Stone Age or something like that. In the Bronze Age, one type of product that clearly entered Canaan from outside was metal. A few metals are sometimes found in that form of nature. Nuggets of copper, silver and gold can be found, as well as occasional lumps of iron where meteorites have fallen. Gold was pretty, but it was very rare and too soft to use as anything but an ornament. Silver wasn't much better and wasn't nearly as pretty. Iron was too hard to shape easily by the techniques of the Neolithic age. Copper, however, was soft enough to hammer into a spear point and hard enough to serve for a while before being blunted, after which it could be hammered sharp again. And that's what the Egyptians used. And then their enemies came in with iron, because they obviously moved into the Iron Age, and they had better weapons. They lasted longer. Better, stronger weapons, supposedly. It's not known exactly when the use of copper first arose, but there is some evidence that it first appeared in the Sinai Peninsula and perhaps as early as 4,500 BC. In any case, tribesmen who possessed the Chalcolithic culture entered Canaan not long after 4,000 BC. Their traces were first detected in excavations at a site called Talaylat El Gasul, just east of the Jordan River and about 9 miles southeast of Jericho. And it goes into the period of Egypt and Samaria, becoming more elaborate. It's quite an interesting book. So you might want to read this particular book. The Amorites gradually took over most of the Fertile Crescent. In the east they put a final end to the Sumerian culture. In the west they took over Canaan. When the early books of the Bible speak of the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, it is these Amorites they mean. The peoples of Arabia spoke closely related varieties of a language family we now call Semitic. People who speak Semitic languages are sometimes referred to in brief as Semites. The Amorites were Semites, and the language they spoke was an early form of the one we now know as Hebrew. Well, Hebrew can't be a language if it was a movement of people. Originally a movement of people. So it's a cover for that language that's been spoken today, that modern language today, which would be or has been found to be a continuation of the ancient Canaanite or Ugaritic language. Because here's the evidence here that these people, these Hebrews, they're of Shem, Noah's sons, one of Noah's sons. They came out of the ark. The children of passage. 21. Hebrews. So that's what they were known as. They may not necessarily have spoken Hebrew. It doesn't sound like they did, because the meaning here is the name Hebrew comes from this name Awa, to cross over. Someone who crosses over, implying passage. So you got Abraham, who's born in Ur of Chaldea, or Chaldee. So he's a Chaldean. He's not a Hebrew. But they have that name because they crossed over. They made a journey to another land. They made a passage to another land, i.e. the children of passage, or the Hebrews. So we hope that you found this very interesting. Also this book, very interesting, by Issac Asimov. We are going to read it further, and here's a chapter on after Abraham. What does this say? The people who dominated Canaan about 8 centuries after the Amorite invasions preserved legends of ancestors who had entered Canaan at that time. It is hard to tell how far the legends are based on fact, but the people who made the claim carefully preserved them because in part it served to legalize their sovereignty over the land. They spoke of an ancestor named Abram, and later Abraham, who was born in the city of Ur in Samaria, and who wandered the length of the Fertile Crescent until he came to Canaan. In Canaan he was described as having made a covenant, that is, a legal agreement with God, by which in return for worship God granted all of Canaan to the descendants of Abraham. This tale is recorded in chapter 12 to 15 in the book of Genesis in the Bible. Those who counted themselves as Abraham's descendants believed this and considered the tale as granting them legal title to Canaan. Associated with the tales and legends that were later collected concerning Abraham and his immediate descendants, Isaac and Jacob, were a number of ancient Canaanite cities. These were reading from north to south: Shechem, Bethel, Salem, Hebron, and Beersheba. Shechem, which lies 30 miles northwest of Jericho, is located in the narrow valley, etc., etc. The biblical tale of the wanderings of Abraham tells of his entry into Egypt during a period of food shortage in Canaan. His experiences in Egypt were not altogether happy, and that was perhaps to be expected, for the Egyptians could scarcely have had much friendly feelings for the Amorite invaders who had wiped out the profitable Egyptian occupation of Canaan. Like I said, they must have invaded and took it off them. Took it from Egypt, who were occupying it. The Egypt into which Abraham entered, possibly about 1900 BC, was peaceful and prosperous. However, for the chaos that had succeeded the decay of the Old Kingdom had finally come to an end. Egypt, under a new series of kings, was once again united into what is called the Middle Kingdom. That took place about 1990 BC, not very long after the Amorite fury fell on the Fertile Crescent. It is surprising that the Amorites, having taken over the Fertile Crescent, did not fall upon Egypt as well. Perhaps they were planning to, and perhaps advanced raiding parties even reached the Nile Delta. The tale of Abraham's descent into Egypt may be a kind of vague memory of that. So they took all those lands like Canaan, etc., that the Egyptians had, and were looking out for enemies and invaders, all that sort of stuff with their towers and etc. But they didn't advance on Egypt itself, by the sounds of it. What may have prevented such raiding parties from becoming a fully fledged invasion was the fact that the Amorite kingdoms established in the Fertile Crescent fought among themselves. The Tigris Euphrates had been the scene of great empires, and the greatest of these had been built up about 2300 BC by Sargon the Akkadian, king of a Semitic people who had entered Samaria centuries before the Amorite invasion. Later traditions stated that its kingdom stretched over the northern arch of the Fertile Crescent and touched the Mediterranean Sea. After the Amorite invasion, however, the Tigris Euphrates region had broken up into separate independent districts that fought each other and were not generally dangerous to outsiders. Once in a while, though, some of them might unite in order to carry on some profitable raids. In the 14th chapter of Genesis, there is a tale of such a raid that took place perhaps about 1900 BC. The raiders swooped across the Fertile Crescent and descended southward east of the Jordan River to take over the more exposed and weaker Amorite kingdoms that had been established in Canaan. Opposing the raiders from the east were 5 cities of the plain, of which the 2 largest were Sodom, Gomorrah. Apparently these cities were located in the general region of the southern end of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea goes on about that, describes that. The Bible speaks highly of the fertility of the regions at that earlier period. Cities of the plain were defeated by the raiders and sacked, and the Bible goes on to describe the manner in which Abraham rescued his nephew Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah, who had been captured by the raiders. The cities did not survive physically, for in the 19th chapter of Genesis the tale is told of their destruction by fire from heaven. It is possible that an earthquake or volcanic eruption or even a large meteorite caused a slight subsidence of the land so that the waters of the Dead Sea flooded southward. The southernmost portion of the Dead Sea is shallow compared to the deep northern portion. This too may have caused a worsening of the climate of the area. The disasters that befell Canaan at this time, the raid from the east and the natural catastrophe, whatever it was, made it possible for Egypt to assert its supremacy in the area after the 2-century interruption caused by the Amorite invasion. About 1850 BC, the Middle Kingdom was at its height, and the Egyptian king Sesostris III was able to send an army into Canaan that reached as far north as Shechem. And you sort of hear about chariots. The Amorites had done their worst by this time, though, and civilization was recovering. Indeed, one of the Amorite rulers, Hammurabi, had established his capital as at the until then undistinguished town of Babylon, and built the most impressive empire that Asia had yet seen. The entire Tigris Euphrates region came under his rule in 1700 BC and reached a new peak of culture, with Babylon itself a world capital for the first time, a position it was to hold for 14 centuries. Wow. Trouble was brewing to the north, however, beyond the mountains that rimmed the Fertile Crescent in that direction. The barbaric tribes of Central Asia had tamed the horse, and by 1800 BC had developed a way of harnessing the animal to a light two-wheeled cart strong enough to hold a man. This was the horse and chariot. Chariots could carry an army over ground far faster than that same army could march on foot. Furthermore, charging horses could usually break a line of foot soldiers. To their horror, the men of the Fertile Crescent found themselves facing irresistible soldiers. The first horsemen included a group of tribes known to us now as the Hurrians. They descended upon the northern arch of the Fertile Crescent from the foothills of the Caucasian Mountains, ranged north of the Tigris-Euphrates immediately after the death of Hammurabi. The horses and chariots thundered down the western prong of the Fertile Crescent into and through Canaan. The Amorite rulers, dazed at the onslaught, could not resist. Some joined the raiders and accompanied them beyond Canaan and rode west across Sinai and into Egypt. For the first time in Egypt's history, she had to face an enemy from beyond Sinai. Egypt could not face the horses any more than Canaan had been able to. Egyptian forces could only break and run, and the Hurrian Amorite raiders occupied the northernmost portion of the Nile Valley about 1680 BC, and did so without a fight. The Middle Kingdom broke down and came to an end. For a century, these non-Egyptian raiders ruled over the Nile Delta. Their religion and culture was not that of the native Egyptians, and they were hated in consequence. The Egyptians called the invaders Hyksos, foreign rulers. So it wasn't Jews or Hebrews or anybody like that. It was the Hurrian Amorites that possibly were the Hyksos, by the looks of it, according to this book. The Egyptians called the invaders Hyksos, foreign rulers. The later Egyptian historians felt deeply humiliated at this episode of defeat in the nation and spoke as little as possible of it, except to vilify the Hyksos as godless and cruel. For that reason, we know almost nothing about the Hyksos period, because they left it out of their histories. Didn't write it down, didn't talk about it. Apparently, though, in that century there was a centralized kingdom stretching over northern Egypt and Canaan, with its capital at Tanis, on the easternmost branch of the Nile. In the Bible, the city is referred to as Zoan. Although the capital was on the Nile Delta, so that the Hyksos ruler might be near the centre of wealth and power, the heart of the dominion lay in Canaan, where the population could identify itself with the rulers rather than in Egypt, where the population was violently hostile. It was the first time in history that a Canaan-centered realm ruled territory outside the western half of the Fertile Crescent. One important Canaanite centre in the time of the Hyksos was Hazor, about 90 miles north of Jerusalem, and so forth. Those later inhabitants of Canaan, who considered themselves descendants of Abraham, had legends concerning the entry of their ancestors into Egypt at the time of the Hyksos invasion. Abraham had a grandson, Jacob, according to the tales preserved in the Bible, who had 12 sons. One of the sons, Joseph, won the favour of the Egyptian king, presumably one of the Hyksos rulers, and served as what we would today call the Prime Minister. Joseph then brought the rest of his family to Egypt, and there they multiplied. So here it's saying the Hyksos rulers at that time were probably those Amorites. That's what it's saying here. During the century in which the Hyksos kingdom flourished, other kingdoms were established farther north and east by the horse and chariot raiders. In the upper regions of the Tigris-Euphrates, on the ruins of Hammurabi's empire, Hurrian tribes coalesced into a kingdom eventually known as Mitanni. Meanwhile, in Asia Minor and other tribes known as the Hatti, or Hittites in the Bible, formed another strong kingdom. The Hurrians spoke a language that has no clear relationship to other languages, but the Hittite language has a kind of grammatical structure associated with almost all the languages of modern Europe and of parts of modern Asia, even as far east as India. The whole family of these languages is known now as Indo-European. Other tribes moved east of the Black Sea and passed through the hilly lands of what is now modern Iran. They called themselves Aryas, meaning noble, and we call them Aryans. So Aryas, we call them Aryans. The word Iran is a form of Aryan. Eventually they moved into India as well. But Egypt at least was not to be counted out. It had never been wholly conquered. The southern part of the Nile Valley had remained in native hands. A new and strong group of these rulers arose, centered about the southern city of Thebes. These had adopted the technique of horse and chariot, and under their king Ahmose, the Egyptians of the south pushed northward. About 1570 BC, the softened Hyksos rulers were driven out. They obviously got fat and lazy, right? They took themselves too seriously and got fat and lazy, or weak. The softened Hyksos rulers were driven out of the delta, and Egypt was re-established in its entirety. It was now the new kingdom, and this was the period of its greatest strength, one in which its kings gained the title of pharaoh, great house or palace, from the place where they lived. So it would have been a great house or palace of Ramses or Ahmose, right? They were the strongest monarchs on earth. The new kingdom was not content to have consolidated its rule over Egypt. The humiliation of the Hyksos invasion was not forgotten. At all costs, the northeastern border must be made safe so that tribesmen from Asia could never violate the Nile Valley again, and so forth. We'll end it there. We hope that you enjoyed this video about this book by Issac Asimov, the Canaan, and so forth. If you did, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, add your comments below the video, and then go share it with all those you know, your family, friends, Christian friends, etc., who may have been told a different story about the Hyksos, etc., etc. You'd have to study Asimov more to see if he's actually accurate in what he details within this book, in his books.